All right, let's see it. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are one of the most important archaeological discoveries in the history of biblical archaeology. However, I don't know that there are very strong evidence that the Bible is true or that it has credibility. They really have no bearing on whether or not the narratives described within the biblical text are true. They are just manuscript witnesses to the text that in most cases come from centuries afterwards, and so they don't really constitute evidence of the historicity of the claims of the text. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls attest to at least some portion, however small, in some cases only a few verses, of every book of the Hebrew Bible except for Esther. And there's absolutely nothing from the New Testament in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But anyone who has studied the Dead Sea Scrolls at any length knows that for almost every verse that is attested within the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is a variant reading somewhere. And for those verses that have multiple manuscripts, there are often multiple variants. And so I think the Dead Sea Scrolls actually provide pretty strong evidence that in this time period, the text of the Hebrew Bible was pretty unstable and pretty fluid and was still being changed. Sometimes that's not very significant. Other times it is quite significant. For instance, we only have a few small fragments of the book of Jeremiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the variant readings in those fragments line up with the Septuagint's translation of the book of Jeremiah, which is 1/6 shorter than the version of the book of Jeremiah we have in the Masoretic text, which comes from centuries later. And so this indicates that the book of Jeremiah has been expanded significantly since it was originally composed and since the manuscripts that we find among the Dead Sea Scrolls were transcribed. So the Dead Sea Scrolls really provide evidence that the text in many cases is not credible, and doesn't really bear at all on whether or not the claims made in the text are true. So I've never really understood the appeal of this chart, and it certainly doesn't constitute evidence that the claims in the text are true or that the text has credibility. The fact that the Bible is richly self-referential is a pretty natural outcome of a rather small insular community accumulating centuries of texts about its own history. The difference between this text and the other texts from the ancient world that do similar things but on much smaller scales is that the ideological communities that preserve and use these texts have survived down to today, while the ideological communities that began to accumulate those other texts were destroyed at some point anciently or came to an end. Additionally, when you look at the description of this chart, this isn't really charting the creativity or the self-referentiality of the authors themselves. Here's how the creator of this chart describes a cross-reference. First off, this is cross-references found in the King James Bible. So we're already basing this on a translation that is frequently articulated so as to create resonances between verses where that resonance may not be so clear. But they describe cross-references this way. They are conceptual links between verses connecting locations, people, phrases, etc. found in different parts of the Bible. So it's not that a passage is referring to another passage. It's that a passage is using a concept or referring to a person or referring to a place that is referred to elsewhere in the text. So, for instance, Genesis 1 has a bunch of cross-references because they mark a cross-reference every time the word creator or creation appears anywhere else in the Bible, whether or not it is referring clearly to Genesis 1. So this is more an illustration of the connections that we can draw today within the different texts of the Bible than it is an illustration of the connections that were intentionally drawn anciently. And so this is a pretty inaccurate chart for what people think it's doing, and it's certainly not in any way, shape, or form evidence that the Bible is true or has credibility. The only thing that's referenced in the Bible of which Josephus was an actual eyewitness would be the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple under the hands of the Roman Emperor Vespasian around 70 CE. Josephus is our closest and most important source for the history of Judea and its relationship with Rome in the 1st century CE, and Josephus as a source attests to the existence of figures that are mentioned in the Bible, but not as an eyewitness. And I don't think there are any other events mentioned anywhere in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, of which Josephus is actually an eyewitness. So note that this article is not entitled 10 pieces of archaeological evidence for the Bible, but 10 crucial archaeological discoveries related to the Bible, because many of them just provide geopolitical and literary context for the development of the Bible. They're not evidence for the historicity of the Bible. So, for instance, the first thing on the list, the Rosetta Stone, helped us decipher Egyptian, which helps us establish the geopolitical context and better understand the literary milieu at the time. It's not direct evidence for the Bible. Then we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have already been discussed, and then it goes on to the Tel Dan inscription, which is phenomenally important, is one of our earliest attestations to these kings of Israel that are mentioned, as well as to the use of the divine name as a theophoric element in personal names, and it also seems to mention the House of David, a Davidic dynasty that was not yet a full-fledged kingdom. But it's going to go on from there to mention things like the Ugaritic texts and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and things that are very important for helping us understand the development of the literature of the Bible, but actually point away from the historicity of the claims of the Bible, and rather point towards the borrowing of traditions from other societies and their literature, and their reworking to fit the rhetorical and ideological exigencies and goals of the authors and editors of the Bible. So it's actually, in many ways, evidence against the notion that the Bible is true and has credibility. So in the end, this video hasn't really provided much evidence at all that the Bible is true and has credibility. This creator is engaging with these data on a very superficial, very surface level, not because they have any real understanding of them or of their significance, but probably just because they've seen other people appeal to them apologetically, and so they want to do the same.